Hi everyone, so I think this is going to be the last video in the series of this Sennelier Botanical Watercolor set palette. I have done quite a few videos based on mixing the greens, transparency test, my first impressions, which wasn't the first impressions weren't great for me, and having now really spent a lot of time researching and kind of reading about this brand, I wanted to do a video that kind of sums up all of the qualities of this watercolor, and hopefully that will help you to understand whether this watercolor is for you or not. So to begin with, Sennelier, obviously it has in the logo, it has everywhere this little bee symbol, and they try to highlight the fact that in their binder they use honey. I think they're also using Gamma Arabic, if I'm not mistaken, with honey as well. So they're not the only brand that use honey. Schminke is renowned for using honey, and I think my personal opinion is that Schminke does it in a better way, where their watercolors look very luscious. They're actually I can just quickly show you the palette. So the half pans that they're renowned for always look super fresh, and they have that glossiness to them. And if you look into, for example, these watercolors that I have squeezed out here, they almost have a kind of like an opaque sort of velvet finish to them, so they don't have that glossiness. Not all of them, but some of them. Now, the other thing that I found out is that Sennelier is typically known for its great glazing and layering values. So in watercolor there is a technique called glazing, and in essence it means that you are going to layer the watercolor on top of the previous layer, and you can repeat the layers. Some of the watercolors don't work very well for this, because if you attempt to do that, you can sometimes pick up the color underneath it and it makes a mess. These, however, are great for exactly this technique, and moreover they actually intensify the color. So you're not supposed to use a lot of this color to begin with, so you use them very watered out, very subtle, and then you build up the color by applying layers and layers on top. So this is a very specific kind of quality to Sennelier, because all of the other watercolors that I have tried before, you get that instant vibrancy and transparency with them. If you use a lot of watercolor, it ends up being quite sort of chalky looking. So a great example would be Sennelier Yellow Deep. You can see it almost looks like gouache, and I will talk you through this in a moment. So and the reason these particular colors have been, by the way, if you wonder why they are in this order, and I have now put them in the order that I prefer them, and I swatched the swatch card as well, which I will mention to you. So this is the original order that they came in, first with the blues, then following yellows. So yeah, in botanical art, this glazing technique is used very often to achieve that realistic and vibrant kind of look on the flower petals, to make them pop and to make them look quite satin in a way. So I hope that makes sense, and hence obviously these particular 12 colors were picked by Billy Showell, the botanical watercolor artist, and therefore, you know, this particular palette is great for what it says. for botanical art. So if you are not really familiar with botanical art and the glazing technique, then you might actually struggle, and that is the reason why I didn't like these watercolors to begin with, because I actually don't like the glazing and the layering technique at all in watercolor, because I tend to overwork things and it starts to look quite flat for me. So what I typically use is a watercolor that is very vibrant and transparent, so that when I apply it with the first brush stroke, it gives me that wow factor, and I can then move on, and if I need to dilute it or create texture, I can use that with water and nothing else. So I hardly ever go back to a watercolor area and glaze it. Mostly I really don't do that at all. So for that matter, I have struggled with these watercolors. So Sennelier basically regard themselves as a watercolor that is transparent. However, they say that their brand produces watercolors that have this kind of velvet or satin finish, and quite honestly, in my opinion, I think this is just a another way of describing opacity. I think any other watercolor brand would call that opaque. They call it, however, satin. So I'm not entirely sure what the difference would be, and I will show you in a bit what I mean by that. And again, having researched the botanical art and spoken to a friend of mine who has helped me to understand a little bit what the botanical art watercolor techniques really are. So apparently you don't need to have all transparent colors, and it is okay to have some colors that are opaque, because they are quite intense, and you can then mix them with the transparent watercolors and create a more kind of transparent color, but still have it quite intense. And so that's essentially, so the watercolor for botanical art doesn't have to be transparent, as I thought. You can play around, and moreover, actually these velvet and satin qualities are fantastic for creating a realistic looking flower petal, because if you have a close-up of a flower petal, you will notice that velvetness of it. So you do need that apparently, and hence it makes sense why some of these colors are pretty opaque. So let's now talk about two colors that I have actually found something about. So the Sennelier red and the quinacridone gold. So first of all, when you look at the details or the info, you will see that this is the color number. Then you have the series number underneath. The higher the series number, the more expensive it is to make the watercolor, and therefore it will also retail as more expensive. So in this case it's series 3 for quinacridone gold and series 2 for Sennelier red. Now if you look next to the series, there are stars, and these stars are supposed to verify the light fastness. So according to Sennelier, 3 stars mean it's very good, so it's the top you can get. However, if you turn the colors onto the other side, and I'll pick another color, this is the alizarin crimson lake, and you check out the ASTM rating for the light fastness, you will see that on this one it says 3, and that would be average, so it's not great. So if you look at the back here, it says 2, which is in fact good. So this is where the confusion comes. You know, what do you trust? Do you trust the good, the 2 stars, or do you trust the ASTM? And that brings me to the next point. So coming back to the Sennelier Red and Quinacridone Gold, if you look at the ASTM rating for light fastness, it says NR on both of them. NR means not rated, in other words, not listed. So when you look on the top, for some reason you get 3 stars, which is very good. So I guess not everyone would notice this, but I have really done my in-depth research and noticed that. So it's up to you what you make out of it and which light fastness do you trust. I personally don't feel very comfortable with having 2 different, actually 2 completely different ratings, one which doesn't even have any listing and the other being very good. So like I said, it's up to you to make your mind up what you think about this. So finally, let's talk about these. So I have found out that actually I have found it out by doing a swatch card, because I always use the arches. If you've seen some of my previous videos, then you know that for my swatch cards I always like to use the arches rough it's a rough paper, so it's more textured than the cold pressed. And the reason I like it is because it gives me a very good idea of the watercolor granulation, and also how the color looks in different tones because of the grooves, and when the color goes into those grooves you get better idea. Also, whatever watercolor you will swatch on arches, which is 100% cotton paper, will always look their best. This paper makes watercolor incredibly smooth and incredibly vibrant. So that's one thing. So on this paper I actually was quite amazed how watercolors looked compared to the other 3 papers that I have tried it on. So to begin with, I'll show you a comparison of this, the first swatches here. So if I put them next to one another, I hope you can see. I'll zoom out a touch. I hope you can see the difference, how much more smoother and how much more vibrant these are on this paper. Now, this paper is a journal watercolor paper, and I'll tell you exactly what it is. So it's a 200 GSM, and it's a mixed, it's a smooth and cold textured. So I tried it on the smooth, and this is the cold textured. So I wasn't too impressed. Now let's look at the yellows here, and let's look at the yellows on this paper, and look what a huge difference it is. So that's this yellow, that's this yellow, and that's the Quinacridone Gold, and look at the massive difference it makes. Same thing with these blues. So this is the French ultramarine, cobalt blue, and phthalo blue. So what I find difficult to understand is that, so for example, if you take the white nights, which is these ones here, you can see how beautifully vibrant they are, and if I flick quickly back to these, you can see a massive difference in the yellows and the oranges. So for me, a watercolor should look good on any type of paper, and yes, of course it will look better on the 100% cotton, but it still should look good on you know, lighter papers, which with Sennelier, if you're planning to buy Sennelier to use in your journals, I would recommend not to do that, because it's not going to look great. If you're prepared to use Sennelier on 100% cotton to get the best result, then go for it. So next thing, let's talk about, so then I also tried it on this paper and I got a similar result to here. And that is the Caddy papers, and it's a 320 GSM. It's a gelatin sized paper and it's 100% recycled. So texture is very similar. Arches is 300, so this is 320, even more weighted, and you can see how very different it looks. So let's look at the yellows. And so this is the Sennelier Yellow Deep, the color that I really dislike. However, on the arches it looks a lot better, and so does the quinacridone gold. Here it almost looks brown, and here it looks beautiful. Orange as well. You can see how flat it looks on here, and it looks quite vibrant over here. And even phthalo blue actually looks a lot more saturated here for some reason than it does here. What else is there to point out? The pinks are okay. There is nothing too different on the pinks. So there's a major color shift within those colors that just explained or showed you. And then let's have a look at the fourth paper which I tried. It's the Daleroni 300 GSM hot pressed, and this is the 100% cellulose. And what that means is that it repels water or moisture, so it will show granulation quite well. And you know, immediately you can see that cobalt blue and red orange are mostly granulated. I can't notice much of granulation on the others. There is a bit of granulation that comes through on this paper on Sennelier Red and Rose Madar Lake. The rest seem to be smooth.